Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Tuohig, as Seth mentioned. I am with J.D. Power and Associates. And, you know, there's been some amazing talks here today already. A lot of focus on social media analysis, you know, really bleeding edge ways of applying sentiment analysis, you know, new ways of thinking about sentiment analysis. I'm actually going to tell you a bit about the work that we're doing in a little bit more practical sense, and really in the corporate market research world. I think many companies have customer feedback programs, and we've been doing some work to use text analytics in order to take a little bit different approach in how we set these programs up. I'll tell you a little bit about work we've been doing with one of our clients around a Net Promoter program, and hopefully share some things that we've learned along the way that are meant to be just sort of practical learnings that you can apply today, whether it's a Net Promoter program or something else. So I guess the first point would be just to level set on what is Net Promoter for anyone who's not familiar with that. Net Promoter is a methodology for gauging the customer experience of a company. It is a very sort of simplistic approach to measuring the customer experience, created by a gentleman named Fred Reichheld, based on some work he did at Bain, and made popular through this book, The Ultimate Question. And the way it works is this. You essentially ask this one simple question on a 0 to 10 scale: would you recommend our service to a friend or colleague? And with 10 being extremely likely and 0 being not at all likely. And then those who are 9 and 10, or who give a 9 and 10, are considered promoters. Those who give a 0 to 6 are considered detractors, and then those in the middle at 7 and 8 are considered passives. And your Net Promoter score is simply the percentage of promoters minus the percent of detractors. So obviously it's a very simple approach to getting to that score. And certainly a fair question is, well, why is this a big deal at all? Why would you just take such a simplistic approach? And the reason is that Reichheld showed that the Net Promoter score across a number of industries correlates strongly with revenue growth. And so just by asking that simple question and really tracking how you're doing on that Net Promoter score, you then get a sense for, are you teed up to drive revenue growth or not? So the natural next question is, what do I need to do to improve my Net Promoter score? And that is actually where the methodology starts to get a little squishy. And so that's where we pick it up with this story of one of our clients. We've been working with a large retail bank for a few different years, on a few different tracking programs, that is, where we're measuring the customer experience through various channels. So if you go to a retail bank branch and you have a transaction there, you're likely to get a survey afterwards to ask how it was. They had tried a number of different approaches, and they had adopted the Net Promoter score methodology, but we're finding it difficult to get good diagnostic information as to what they should be fixing, because when you get that kind of a survey, the last thing you want to do is answer that one simple question and then a battery of 30 to 50 additional questions to try to figure out what went well or what didn't go well with your experience. So that's where we started working with them and suggested that we take more of a text analytics approach to try to get to those kinds of diagnostics. So I'll share a few of the things that we learned along the way in that process. So instead of asking that big battery of 30 to 50 questions to try to figure things out, we would pass in information that came from the customer record. So we know a little bit about them already, just from what this client already knew about them. And then we'd ask the Net Promoter question, and with that we can get the score. And then we just simply ask, why did you give the score that you did? And then we end up and essentially let people say pretty much anything about their experience through an open-end survey question. Now, that led to a huge influx of unstructured data. That, of course, is where text analytics comes in to help with that. And so our first step to kind of get our arms around it was to create this multi-dimensional or multi-level taxonomy of categories that covers all the different topics that people can talk about. What was interesting, of course, is that sometimes people talk about exactly what you ask about, and other times they talk about something completely different. So, we took a sort of a supervised and unsupervised approach to try to figure out, what are all the categories we need to put in place to cover what's being discussed. And it's a very iterative process. We ended up with something on the order of, a couple of hundred different categories that obviously you can only handle through an automated approach as opposed to hand coding. Now, from there, one of the things that we learned is that even though you may start with this comprehensive taxonomy that covers all the different topics people discuss, over time, new things can crop up. And so one of the things we learned is we had to keep an eye on what we call the uncategorized bucket. These were verbatims that essentially had no home anywhere in the taxonomy. They just weren't being categorized anywhere. To some degree, you always expect a certain amount of that, right? People sometimes just say, NA, or nothing to say, or see above, or something like that. So you always expect a little bit of that. But if you see an increase in that, that could be a hint that new things are cropping up. And sure enough, in the financial services space over the last few years, there's been a lot of drama, a lot of turmoil, and sometimes, with current event issues that would show up, even though we're asking about the branch experience, people would say, I just gave you a 2 because your CEO just did a perp walk. What does that say about you? What does it say about me to do business with you, right? So, people would get emotional about some of these kinds of things, and these were issues that we hadn't anticipated when we set up the original taxonomy. So one lesson learned was you have to keep an eye on that uncategorized bucket along the way. For the most part, we would target no more than 30%. Anything above that, for the most part, suggests that you're probably missing something. But again, we would typically keep an eye on that, and we would start with a lower target, more like the 15 to 20%. But if that were to increase over time, then that was a hint that we needed to take a look at what might be popping up. So another dimension that we looked at was this notion of false positives across all these different categories. Obviously, one of the things that you want to look at in a tracking program is if I detect change, there's a certain amount of noise you're going to expect, but if I see a significant shift, I want to make sure it's actually a shift in whatever it is I intend to measure. And so we look for false positives across all these different categories in order to make sure that the verbatims that are being coded into that bucket actually are about whatever the categories intended to be about. In this case, we actually have taken a crowdsource approach because that's a fairly simple thing to test, right? If I have a verbatim, and it's supposed to be about this, is it about it, yes or no? So we can test every single category for the degree of false positives. Again, we target on the order of 15% or less, but usually can get significantly lower than that. But some things are ambiguous enough that it actually is difficult to really get it dialed in. So again, this was kind of a key quality step that we took to give the client confidence that when we see a shift in those trend lines, they're real. It's not just noise about something else bubbling up. And then, of course, there's the dialing in of sentiment in that context. For all the different categories in our taxonomy, we wanted to look at, is the system getting it right? How accurate are we really? And we take a human annotation approach where we will code verbatims from each of the categories and then run those through the system and essentially produce a confusion matrix that gives a sense for how often is the system getting it right or wrong in order to identify where do we have errors showing up. That points the way in terms of an iterative approach to improve sentiment there. Our typical target was 80% or better, but the reality is sometimes we could get far higher than that if it's a straightforward category, and in other cases it was actually difficult to hit that just because of the ambiguous language that's used in that category. So that was a very iterative process, and it's something that we actually measure on a quarterly basis to make sure that what we're using to define those categories is still accurate, still relevant for getting sentiment dialed in. So having gone through all that setup process, then we looked at if we have our categories and if we have sentiment we think dialed in well, does this actually track against net promoter scores? Does it sort of pass the sniff test? I think the answer that we came to is definitely yes, at least directionally so. If you look at the detractor scores, that's 0 to 6, they're predominantly negative. When you get into the passive range, you start to get a little more balanced mix, and when you get into the promoters, it skews positive. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that this can replace net promoter score, but it does serve as a useful tool for us to look at what are the negative things that we want to focus on, and if we focus on those, we will be we have a good shot at moving those who are detractors today up to passives or passives up to promoters. And so really that's how we were thinking about using sentiment in conjunction with these net promoter scores. So looking at the kinds of things we learned in this process, one of the natural things you'd want to look at is, well, let's take the detractors, look at all the negative things they're talking about, and see what shows up most prominently. And so we saw, especially through this period that we looked at in this example, that this was when this bank introduced those new ATMs, where you can just deposit a check without an envelope, and it's using optical recognition to figure out the amounts. People were having all sorts of problems with that, and that was far and away spiking as one of the big drivers of detractors, or those detractor scores. So, and obviously then, as others have pointed out today, when you look into the verbatims themselves, you get a lot of richness that informs your root cause analysis. Well, what specifically was the circumstance? What do people describe as the problem in their experience in that case? So, that was very useful in terms of really focusing the client's efforts on, trying to fix those top issues in order to drive their Net Promoter Score up. We also looked at, across a number of categories, and looked at the distribution of the Net Promoter segments within those to see which ones are predominantly talked about by passives, just to know what kinds of problems drive someone to give a passive level score, but not necessarily a detractor score. And interestingly, we saw that people talked about things like convenience issues, sort of like the bank hours, not being long enough. The bank closed at 4, so that's not convenient, or it only stays open until 6 on Fridays. This issue was annoying. This was something, that definitely, got on people's nerves on the one hand, but it wasn't enough to drive them to give a detractor score, right? I mean, if you're trying to deposit your money and they get the amount wrong or they won't accept it, messing with someone's money creates detractors, it turns out. But inconvenient hours, while there's an opportunity for improvement there, doesn't necessarily drive someone to be a detractor like other issues do. So that's a useful learning from the client's perspective to figure out where you're going to focus your efforts first, where you're going to focus your resources on trying to improve those scores. And then finally, we also looked at other specific categories. In some cases, like a certain stakeholder wanted to know, well, how are we doing when it comes to mobile banking services, for example? And in that case, even though that's a predominantly positive category, generally positive, and even though it's mostly passives and promoters mentioning that, there are still useful suggestions for improvements, useful hints of things that we can do to sort of reinforce the good experience that apparently these folks are having. So even though they give a passive or even a promoter score, they're still suggesting, hey, I wish I could have used your mobile banking app, but the limits are way too low, or the UI isn't as user-friendly as it should be. So that's the kind of thing where, again, if your business strategy is, I'm going to focus on addressing the detractor issues, as well as putting some resources against reinforcing the experience for my promoters, this gives you some hints of the kinds of things you should do. So in summary here, I would say Net Promoter is a valuable methodology, no doubt, but it does require diagnostics to make it actionable. Just knowing that score is a helpful benchmark, but at the end of the day, you got to figure out how you're going to drive it up, and you need diagnostics to do that. Using open-end survey responses can provide those diagnostics in a concise and positive way. So instead of asking 30 to 50, closed-end questions, why not just make it a very short, quick survey, let someone say whatever it is they want to, and then we can deal with whatever they say downstream from there. But of course, in order to do that, you really do have to take a rigorous approach and make sure you set things up the right way. You need that comprehensive taxonomy. You need to watch your uncategorized verbatims, make sure things are not bubbling up unexpectedly or that are newly emerging. You need to test for false positives, make sure that the data that you're collecting really is about what you intend to measure, and then use that human annotation to test sentiment and iteratively dial it in to make sure that you've got solid sentiment that you can lean on. But once you do have that set up, with this kind of a very simple program, it does give you something that's very useful, very actionable, something that can help you prioritize resources when you're looking to make improvements in the customer experience, or at least surface things that you may want to further clarify and test in other forums. So with that, that's what I have. Hopefully we've got a few minutes for questions if there are any.
Hi, Bill. I had a question about you had a slide where you had the bar graphs with the NPS codes 1 through 10 on the left and the sentiment on the right. And I was just curious, are you guys getting automated survey responses on NPS and using some sort of a anonymous unique ID to, grab social sentiment? Or how do you put them in the same buckets to make it comparable?
Yeah, that's right. So the way it works is if someone comes to, let's say, a branch and has an experience, meaning, let's say they open an account or make a deposit, then the client sends a sample from the customer records. So we do have a customer ID that way. We can pass in, so we know who they are. We can pass in information about them. The Net Promoter Score is based on that closed-end question that's asked in the survey, and then the sentiment that we show is based on the open-end survey response, that verbatim question that goes along with it. So we're not pulling in social data in this case. We're actually, all of this data is captured from a customer feedback survey. So if you deal with a company, then commonly you'll get that survey that says, hey, tell us about your experience. And what we're trying to do is make that really short and concise. So all the data that we walk through today is from a survey, and the sentiment assessment is from the open-end verbatim, the unstructured response to that question. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Hi, Bill. This is actually a great talk. I actually work at a company where we're trying to improve our NPS, and we're having some of those same issues around not being able to figure out or get that diagnostic information. We have that battery of 30 or whatever questions as well right after the NPS. So I guess what I'm interested in is there's a lot of good information in here. Is kind of, you didn't talk really about the results for your client. How long have you been doing this? What have they found? Were there improvements? Were they drastic as compared to what they were doing before?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the backstory here is we've been working with this client on this program as a general statement for we're in the 5th year of it now. But this program has morphed sort of through the phases. So in other words, the management and the stakeholders have kind of turned over. In the early days, it really wasn't Net Promoter focused. It was actually general customer experience at first, and then later on, it became a focus on problem resolution. So in the banking, financial services space, the ability to solve your problem the first time, from our other studies, shows it's a key driver of customer satisfaction. So for a while, it was about that. This Net Promoter focus has been in place for about a year now. But sort of the general notion of trying to identify the right levers to pull in order to improve the customer experience was generally true throughout all those different phases. One of the ways that the client is using this is, I think someone mentioned before, this is a strong indicator, but they're not making bet the farm decisions on this data alone. But I would say that most clients that we work with operate that way, right? No one's going to make bet the farm decisions on social media analysis alone or even text analysis on one single survey. Most companies are going to sort of triangulate on a problem to make sure that, okay, if it's true, it's showing up here, but it's also showing up maybe in contact center records. We also see it in the letters to the president kind of things that are showing up. So they'll look for confirmation in multiple places. The thing about a tracking program is that, we're running this, every day. Every day that we get that operates, we basically get a new sample, and so it's continuous sampling, continuous survey in that sense. And so one of the things they'll do is say, all right, for these 100 branches, we're actually going to take a different management technique. We're going to train these people on this different approach, and we're going to ensure that their processes involve, greeting them in a certain way and trying to handle their issues while they're in line before they get to the teller, some certain things like that. And then we can isolate, here are the branches where they did that, here are the branches where they didn't, and sort of do some of that A/B testing that we talked about, that was mentioned before. Or the other thing is, for example, that's one example where they took a different management approach. Another is one of the biggest detractor issues is wait time, right? People don't want to go to the branch. I mean, their time is precious. If they have to wait for 15, 20 minutes, that's a huge driver. So, again, they put in queuing systems that were intended to address those key issues, and they saw that feedback was coming from other channels too. Again, so it was sort of confirmed in multiple places. But with that tracking program approach, you can then see, all right, are the number of comments about wait time issues, sort of decreasing? Is the tone of what people are saying getting less and less negative? So those are some of the practical ways that they're trying to apply this tracking program. Again, it's in conjunction with other data points, but that notion of an ongoing tracking program helps them, sort of gauge whether the things that they're working on are actually moving the needle. All right.